So, I have 72 hours to create an entirely 3D sci-fi world. I was challenged by NVIDIA Studio to create this world from scratch during the duration of CES, which lasts just 3 days. But I won't be entirely empty-handed, because I'm equipped with NVIDIA's super fast GeForce RTX 4090 GPU. For the concept of this world, I ran some polls on social media, and 8,000 plus votes later, most of you guys voted for Sci-Fi. Now 3 days isn't a lot of time, and you already know that we'll be animating the final result, of course, so first of all, go easy on me. James Cameron had 13 years to create Avatar 2, so maybe cut me just a little slack. But enough talk, it's time to start creating a 3D world. Day one was spent working out the designs for these sci-fi buildings that would be spread out throughout this city. After a while of some tinkering, I came up with this chunk of sci-fi garbage, which, using my super limited knowledge of geometry nodes, managed to come up with a simple setup where I could use basic geometry to instance these on top of each other and make it look like a stacked version of sci-fi buildings, expanding into a larger, more complex building. I have a full 5-minute tutorial already on the channel for how I came up with these buildings and created these designs, if you want to check that video out. So once I kind of zeroed in on the style of building, it was time to start focusing on the atmosphere and colors of the scene / world. So for this, I just started looking at different sky backgrounds, kind of looking for what would be the mood of this scene. Once I settled for the colors of the sky, I put that into Blender and aligned it up with the camera, using an HDR as lighting to kind of match this background image and kind of focus the lighting coming from the back, sort of a sunset angle behind this building. So here I just continued moving my procedural buildings around, trying to sort of work out a composition for this world, but ultimately feeling a little uninspired and maybe creatively burnt out a little. So I decided to step back for a minute to get a little bit of fresh air, and get some fresh air I did by clearing off the foot of snow that dumped on my truck overnight during our latest snowstorm here in Upper Michigan. But then I headed to our local ski hill to catch the last little bit of sunshine on the mountain. And as I mentioned for a recent blog post on NVIDIA Studio, which is likely already published if you're watching this video, and that is that I always enjoy finding a little bit of inspiration in nature and the outdoors. Like, take a look at this ski lift. That's kind of sci-fi-ish, right? Yeah, it's pretty, but man, I'm cold. Also, just taking a quick break and getting a little fresh air can give you a new outlook on your artwork. But coming back to my project now, I was having more success working out some composition, and I even came up with this cool little piece of sci-fi junk. Believe it or not, this little piece added a lot of realism to the scene, and it's some of the messiest modeling I might have ever done in my entire life. It's literally just some basic planes bent in different directions and stacked together with some spikes as a basic little piece of sci-fi junk. I then just slapped a metal material on it, and believe it or not, called it good. Because I was back to geometry nodes to expand on my tree of nodes here and add a little bit more realism to my buildings. Basically, I just copied the same setup I did a second time to add this new little piece of sci-fi junk to all my buildings, also subdividing the mesh another time to add more vertices, which ultimately adds more instances. So with these two sets of instances joined together as a single piece of geometry, I was left with this tower of sci-fi junk, which ended up looking way better than it should have with how easy it was to put together. I then used this sort of falling over sci-fi tower to kind of direct your eye towards the center of the scene, placing it over to the left and closer to the camera. It's important to add objects to the foreground and background of your scenes to really add that sense of depth, and these actually worked well for sort of composition guides for your eye to kind of draw your attention to the center of our world, I guess you could say. Then I created a super simple ground mesh, but using adaptive displacement in Blender, I was able to give it a nice looking sort of sci-fi rocky sort of surface, and then combine that with the procedural texture to add some of those hills and rockiness. I also added a few concaves to this ground mesh because I wanted to add some water into the scene for a lake in front of our world. My goal for this was starting to be a little bit of nature, sort of competing with the sci-fi world, not being completely taken over and kind of existing in the same world as all this modern technology. At least that's sort of the basic concept running through my head, but I was really happy with the way the water was looking, and it was a super simple shader setup.
Wow, try saying that 5 times fast.
Just a basic principled shader with a transmission value of 1 and a roughness of 0. Then I used a procedural texture connected to the displacement to add some of the ripples in the water. The coolest part comes with a volume scatter node though, adding sort of a murkiness to the water, and when you have this combined with a ground mesh, it really gives the water that volumetric depth where the deeper the water gets, you really can't see the bottom of the lake anymore. Then it was the ambient occlusion node coming in clutch for some realism. Actually, when I was snowboarding a moment ago, the snow tucked in the corners of the ski lift had me thinking how the AO node could actually be used to create this effect for snow, and what is snow but water? How could I make my water more realistic using the AO node? And I had the idea of using the AO node to add the foam that you'll get around objects, rocks, and whatnot, wherever water interacts with the shoreline. So using the AO node, I created a simple mask to combine two different shaders, one being my simple water shader, and the other shader being something that mimicked bubbles / foam. Using this to combine the two shaders, I was able to procedurally add sort of that white cap to the edges of the lake and add a lot of realism super easy. Well, that wraps up day 1, 12 hours in, still got a lot to go, but I'm starting to see some promising results and I'm getting excited. I'll see you guys tomorrow. Then I worked in the horizon of the scene a little bit just to make it seem like the world continues as far as the eye can see. For this, I used the Ant landscape generator that comes in Blender, a very basic setup involving the Bob Ross pine trees that I created in my last Bob Ross World video, spread out with just a basic particle system this time. You can see these looked quite nice rendered, and sticking these in the background of the world fixed that sort of flat line horizon that I had previous. I had some time to continue adding some realism to my scene. For this, I was adding some ivy vines to some of the older, more broken sci-fi objects in my scene. Now the Ivy Gen add-on worked really well for this and would automatically do it, but at the cost of system performance, as this generates a million vines and doesn't really give you too much control to reduce the quality of them. So the Decimate modifier in Blender came in clutch to sort of save viewport performance, and then for the more distant vines that I was adding to my buildings, I just deleted the vines entirely and only left the leaves. I did have one full-on crash where Windows just hard rebooted, and then my blend scene was corrupt with improper DNA. I don't really know what that means, but it definitely made my heart skip a few beats. Luckily, I was able to recover because Blender automatically saves every 30 minutes or so, and thankfully I didn't lose too much work in that crash. So, frustrated again, it was time to take another step back and do something to clear my head. Now in day 3, I had some time to continue adding some realism to my scene. Right now the world is looking a bit abandoned though, and that's because there's no sort of lights or activity at the base of the city. Now while time was running out, and I obviously didn't have the time to put all sorts of detailed futuristic like cars and buildings throughout the city, what I did instead is I opened up a texture that had some glowing text signs on it. I cut these out of a plane super quick and easy and just gave them a basic emission shader, then randomly dispersing these throughout the base of the city using my geometry node setup yet again with some sci-fi junk. I was able to make it look like there was a lot of activity with the lights and stuff going on at the base of this city. I even took some of the 3D scans I created from a recent video and stuck some characters throughout the base of the city as well, as a way of sticking myself and some of my siblings in this world, but it's gonna be so tiny and small that no one will probably even notice. And this is where using the GeForce RTX 4090 is just so way overpowered. Being able to add objects and move characters and lights around all in real time with cycles is just something we've never been able to do before until RTX came to the GeForce GPUs and Blender. So doing all this in real time, I was able to add some more lights and objects, filling out the city really quick and easy, seeing exactly what it's going to look like all in rendered view to make sure I get the sort of shadows and fall off that I'm looking for, which just completely sped up my workflow and really just made a project in a timeline like this possible. Then I also wanted to add a character to the scene because it really kind of gives it a sense of scale and makes it, again, as I've been saying, look less abandoned. So for this, I thought it would be cool if the character sort of interacted with the scene, so I definitely needed some custom animation. So I turned to my motion capture suit, and getting suited up, my idea of this was to have a character walk along, pick up a rock, and throw it into the water just to kind of make him really feel attached to the scene. So doing my best Andy Serkis acting, I came up with this motion capture animation. For that character, I used one of them off of Mixamo. The one I went with was actually just a guy in a mocap suit because one, it is kind of sci-fi to be walking around in a motion capture suit, and two, I just thought it was kind of funny. But every once in a while, adding motion capture data to a rigged character gets a little freaky. Okay, so at this point, I'm pretty sure the rig is cursed and there is no chance I'm sleeping tonight. Then to really add a sense of depth to the scene, I started doing smoke overlays. Just as you would a still image, but this time using video overlays to add animated smoke effects using a very simple shader in Blender that's just adding a little bit of transmission and then using the black and white values to control the transparency. I went ahead and duplicated these though throughout the entire city, behind and in front of buildings to add extra depth and sort of that volumetric fog. Also, it helped add to the activeness of the scene with some smoke, it definitely seemed less abandoned. So then using the mist render pass out of Blender, I was using this in combination with those smoke overlays to add a lot of atmosphere to our sci-fi world. I also went through and added some glows to some of the city lights in there, but at this point I was down to my final 12 hours and I still needed to render the animation. So quickly going through and animating some of the different properties of the scene, like the leaves for example, I did this with the simple displacement modifier using an animated texture to move the leaves just ever so slightly. Some of the floating buildings I gave a little bit of an anti-gravity sort of floating effect. At this point it was time for the rendered animation, rendering this world on a single RTX 4090 at 4K 1000 samples took just over 2 minutes a frame, which for the amount of detail I piled into the scene was crazy fast, and it rendered approximately 350 frames, which means that as long as I didn't stay up past 2 AM again tweaking details in the scene, it should be able to render all night long and be done the following morning. So here we are on the final day with a little bit of color grading added to our final animation. Here's what we came up with during our NVIDIA Studio 3D challenge, creating a sci-fi world. That was a ton of fun. I always love these challenges as they always kind of push you to go further. And thanks again to our sponsor, NVIDIA Studio. They are always empowering creators with new tools, drivers, and resources. Learn more on how the Studio platform helped me pull off this 3D sci-fi world in just 72 hours in their latest blog post linked below. And I definitely need to go get some sleep at this point. So if you enjoyed this video or had any questions, let me know with a comment below. I will see you guys all in a future video. Bye-bye.